Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Word of the Day podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Jamie Silva, recording probably a couple days before you'll hear this, right here in the cozy confines of the RAV4 studios. So let's get right into it. The word is sophisticate. Now this should remind you of another word that it's possible you're already familiar with, the adjective sophisticated, which I think basically means very cultured, very well acquainted with highbrow and classy pursuits, and it can just refer to the pursuits themselves. The online definition of sophisticated goes like this, quote, having, revealing, or proceeding from a great deal of worldly experience and knowledge of fashion and culture, unquote. Now remember, that's the adjective, sophisticated, whereas sophisticate is its lesser-known noun cousin. So a sophisticate is simply a sophisticated person. Longtime listeners of this show will remember episode 13, which featured the word Philistine, and this refers to someone with no appreciation for the arts and for culture and such. If you want to refresh yourself on that word, feel free to pause here, go back, download that episode, and listen to it. Okay, presuming you have now listened and returned, you probably know that a Philistine is basically the polar opposite of a sophisticate. Everything that Philistines dislike, sophisticates will probably pay lots of money to see or do. Thus, if you want to compliment someone's excellent taste in something, they're expensive or elevated or, well, honestly, the best word for this is probably, their sophisticated taste. You can say, wow, you are such a sophisticate. And you can mean this in a nice way, like you admire how much enjoyment they seem to get out of modern art exhibitions, or how they never appear more at home than when they're scanning a wine list. On the other hand, many might also use the word sophisticate in a dismissive or scoffing way, in order to make fun of those who fancy themselves sophisticates, but are in reality simply pretentious, and too full of themselves, too hoity-toity to enjoy the things that ordinary people like. So it all depends on who's saying it, and whether they are rolling their eyes as they do so. I should also warn you that if you use the word sophisticate, you may come off as one, either in a good or bad way, depending. For the sake of learning and the glory of cool words, let's now go beyond this most common meaning into an alternate and, I believe, older and certainly less used meaning of sophisticate, one that's actually a verb, which means it's going to be pronounced sophisticate, and this means to mix or change something, but in a bad way. Like, if you mixed in some ordinary flour with some fancier almond flour, you have sophisticated the almond flour. You have diluted it. You've made it cheaper and worse, probably in order to hornswoggle episode 17, or to cheat a hapless customer who was hoping to buy 100% pure almond flour, but now they can't because you sophisticated it. And so, in regard to people, sophisticate, again the verb, means something similar. It means to change someone so they're no longer like their young and innocent and naive selves. Now they've mixed themselves about in the world, and they've seen and heard, so much. They have fancy tastes, and so their natural simplicity and their kind of contented ignorance is gone away. And this is not good. The person who has been sophisticated is the worse off for it. So notice that we've gone all the way back to our original definition of sophisticated as very cultured and worldly, but now the connotation is quite negative. To illustrate this further, consider this mildly paraphrased selection from a novel by the French author Honoré de Balzac, who says, quote, some parts of my story can only be understood by a delicate tenderness, and through the beliefs that dwell in simple hearts. Beliefs that would seem absurd to sophisticated people who prefer the maxims of worldly wisdom. Maxims here referring to principles or rules of conduct, kind of the way things are generally done. So what this author is saying is that if you become sophisticated, if the world sophisticates you, so to speak, then you lose touch with simple truths and a certain serenity of soul that comes with quiet and humble living. Here's another way of looking at it from an article that I came across during my research, which I have linked in the show notes for this show on our website, which you can find at wotdpodcast.com/show notes. And this was written by a wine critic who talks about how even if you are quite ignorant about wine, you can still enjoy it immensely, as much as anyone, in fact. But once you gain tons of knowledge about wine, you sophisticate yourself in this area. Then you're able to talk about it in exalted terms, perhaps referring to how the full-bodied minerality of the Zinfandel boldly salutes the palate, while the oaky tannins of the fruit-forward Moscato carry an unpretentious yet inscrutable flavor that invites respect, if not familiarity. And as a sidebar, obviously I don't know what any of what I just said means. As a wine sophisticate, you can have all of this knowledge, all of this worldly wisdom about wine, but in your sophistication, you may lose the simple happiness of simply sipping a glass of wine after dinner without busying your head with critiques and evaluations and analysis, utterly oblivious to its quality, but fully aware that it's tasty and you enjoy it. And really, what more do you need? So again, this is sort of the darker side of being a sophisticate, at least in this alternate sense that focuses on the downsides of too much worldly knowledge. But it bears repeating that this is not the most common sense in which you would hear or use sophisticate. And remember that most often it more or less means the opposite of a Philistine, just someone who knows lots about and appreciates arts and culture. So let's review what sophisticate would look like in ordinary conversation with the examples. Example number 1. After spending half his gap year socializing in the bustling metropolitan centers of Vienna and Budapest, and the other half living amongst the indigenous peoples of New Guinea, Isaac considered himself quite the sophisticate. Example number 2. A true sophisticate, Mandy ignored the cheap thrills of the mall and movie theater and preferred the provocative intellectualism of the stage. Example number 3. It's another sophisticate Saturday, said Dirk, glancing at his day planner. That means I'll be attending a seminar on the history and uses of cashmere, which should wrap up by 4 o'clock, just in time for this month's Pachelbel in the Park concert. Okay, that is all for the word of the day proper, but we would now like to present a brand new segment, one in which we will read and discuss some choice selections from a book called Manners, Culture, and Dress, a copy of which is in our possession. We'll let the author tell us from the preface what this book is all about. Quote, "Manners constitute the language in which the biography of every individual is written. There is no subject of today that embodies more practical interest to people in general than a knowledge of the rules, usages, and ceremonies of good society." Well, you may be thinking, I had no idea that today, in 2017, people find nothing more fascinating than etiquette. If this was your thought, your suspicions are well-founded. Manners, Culture, and Dress was first published in the year 1890. I am sure, however, that the author would never exaggerate for marketing purposes the public's appetite for manners-related content, and thus it must have been true at that time that etiquette was all the rage. Now, there is in this book a section on conversation etiquette in particular, which I think is especially relevant to the listeners of this show. You're not just broadening and solidifying your vocabulary, you're becoming a well-rounded conversationalist in so many ways. So now, may we present for the first time the new segment, Conversation Etiquette from a dozen decades ago. And what better place to begin than with a paragraph entitled, "The Best Kind of Conversation." Quote, "That conversation is best which furnishes the most entertainment to the person conversed with, and calls upon him for the least exercise of mind." This sounds like you want the experience of talking to you to be very much like watching television. Maximum entertainment, minimal mental energy. And in fact, the selection goes on to say, "It is for this reason that argument and difference are studiously avoided by well-bred people. They tax and tire." Unquote. And by the way, tax in this context means basically to make you tired or exhausted, because you've expended so much energy on something, quite possibly mental or emotional energy. So just like many economists would argue high taxes on, say, production will discourage and reduce production, something or someone that taxes your patience or energy will reduce your patience or energy. They will use it up. So to get back to the conversation etiquette lesson here, arguing with people or apparently making them think at all taxes them, makes them feel tired, and possibly just tired of hanging out with you. This does seem like it might make conversations a little dull a lot of the time, but it's probably a pretty good rule of thumb, especially if you don't know someone super well. Probably the polite way to converse is to focus just on entertaining them, rather than peppering them with thought-provoking personal questions or firm opinions on controversial subjects. Okay, that will do it for today's show. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you feel a little bit more like a language sophisticate than you did at the start of this episode. unless you think of Sophisticates as dull and arrogant snobs, in which case we hope you were simply entertained. If you have any questions or comments about the show, don't forget that you can always email us at wotdpodcast@gmail.com. We reply to every email with relish. Until next time, then, this has been the Word of the Day podcast. I'm Jamie Silva.